On the evening of October 12, 1978, the small industrial town of Youngstown, Ohio, was shrouded in an early autumn fog that clung to the steel mills and dimly lit streets. That night, the Monroe siblings, Anna, 11, and Jacob, 9, left their modest home on Jefferson Avenue to walk the short distance to their grandmother's. Never arrived. Neighbors later recalled hearing the distant growl of a black sedan idling near the curb, its headlights dimmed, but few paid attention in a neighborhood where cars came and went at odd hours. By morning, the children had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only a half-eaten caramel on the sidewalk. The initial response was immediate but poorly coordinated. Local police canvassed, questioned residents, and scoured nearby woods, yet no solid lead emerged. Their parents, Linda and Harold Monroe, begged for answers, clinging to hope as volunteers formed search parties. The media swarmed the case, dubbing it the Monroe Mystery, and reporters hounded the family relentlessly. But beneath the surface of apparent diligence, hidden interests were already at play, and the machinery of corruption was slowly turning to bury the truth. The city itself was in decay. Unemployment high, steel jobs vanishing, crime thriving. Organized crime had taken deep root in Youngstown, exploiting the desperation of population. Racketeering, illegal gambling, and covert drug operations ran parallel to daily life, often tacit blessing corrupt. Unknown to the Monroe family, their children's disappearance would soon intersect those dark becoming entangled in a network far larger than a simple abduction. Suspicion initially fell on a drifter who had been spotted near the schoolyard days earlier, but investigators quickly learned he had left town before the children disappeared. Other theories emerged: a runaway attempt, a custody dispute, or even a cult abduction. Each possibility was explored, then abandoned, leaving the family adrift in grief and confusion. Behind the scenes, crucial evidence was already being manipulated, erased, or quietly filed away by those with a vested interest in silence. At one point, an officer reported seeing the black sedan on a traffic. The footage was conveniently lost. Official logs were altered to show no vehicle matching that description on Jefferson Avenue. A local dispatcher who claimed to have received a suspicious call about children crying near the steel mill was abruptly reassigned, and the report vanished from record. From the start, the Monroe case was not merely an unsolved disappearance, it was a silenced one. As days turned into weeks, volunteers dwindled, the media lost interest, and officials insisted there was no evidence of foul play. Linda Monroe, however, never believed her children had run away. She haunted the police station daily, her presence a constant reminder of what had been lost. She had no idea she was standing against a wall of collusion that reached higher than she could imagine. Years passed, and the case grew cold. By the mid-1980s, investigators who had once promised answers admitted they had nothing. Files gathered dust in archives, and new detectives, assigned only out of formality, quickly learned the Monroe case was one they were not meant. Rumors circulated that the children had been taken to serve as leverage in a gambling debt dispute or sold across state lines. None of these theories were ever substantiated, but they lingered in the public imagination. In 1991, a new special task force was quietly assembled within the FBI to probe unsolved child disappearances linked to organized crime. Among their cases was the Monroe siblings. Unlike local police, these agents suspected foul play with powerful protection behind it. They discovered odd discrepancy, missing evidence tags, audio tapes marked as blank, and navigation records from patrol cars contradicted official reports. It became clear someone had deliberately sabotaged the original investigation. One retired officer, speaking off-record, admitted he had been told to look the other way by a superior who had financial ties to the Mahoning Syndicate, a criminal group notorious for its grip on Youngstown. The syndicate, they learned, had deep connections to certain detectives, judges, and city council members at the time. To accuse them openly was dangerous. Several whistleblowers who hinted at corruption had faced sudden accident. False leads emerged constantly, each consuming precious time and energy. Anonymous letters claimed the children were alive in Canada. A tip alleged they had been seen in Nevada. When agents followed up, they found carefully planted misdirection, fake witnesses, altered photographs, even false birth certificates. It was a campaign of deliberate confusion designed to keep the truth forever out of reach. Despite setbacks, the siblings' case gained symbolic weight. It represented not only two missing children, but decades of systemic failure. Linda Monroe died in 1997 without answers. Her last words to her surviving children, a plea: "Don't let them be forgotten." Sorry. Her grief passed like a torch, keeping the case alive among federal agents who refused to let it slip into obscurity. By the 2000s, technology opened new possibilities. Archived traffic camera reels were digitized, exposing edits and tampered sections. Satellite navigation data, thought primitive in 1978, revealed discrepancies in patrol car location. A pattern emerged. On the night of the disappearance, at least two marked police cruisers were near the Jefferson Avenue intersection, though no officer admitted to being there. The investigation was back in motion, but danger loomed for those who dared unravel it. By 2004, nearly 3 decades after Anna and Jacob Monroe disappeared, the FBI task force had built a timeline riddled with contradiction. The more they pulled at the threads, the more a disturbing picture emerged. The children's vanishing was not a random crime of opportunity, but a carefully orchestrated operation tied directly to the Mahoning syndicate. Still, without hard evidence, every discovery felt like chasing shadows. Local officials continued to downplay the case, treating it as an unfortunate but unsolvable mystery from the past. Behind closed doors, however, the task force knew the truth was buried beneath layers of deceit and protection. One of the most damning discoveries came from a series of storage boxes mislabeled as traffic citation in the county archive. Inside, agents uncovered logbook with irregularities. Officers had signed in and out of duty hours that contradicted GPS pings retrieved from their old patrol cars. One cruiser in particular had spent over 40 minutes parked near an abandoned warehouse by the Mahoning River on the very night of October 12, 1978. No mention of that stop appeared in the official records. The warehouse, agents learned, was at the time owned by a shell company tied to the syndicate. The agents decided to covertly investigate the warehouse site, though it had long since been demolished and redeveloped into a parking lot. Ground-penetrating radar revealed strange soil disturbances beneath the asphalt. The city council, citing budget constraints, refused to authorize excavation. It was yet another wall built by political allies of the syndicate, showing how corruption still reached into the present. The team, frustrated but undeterred, began gathering evidence not only about the disappearance, but also about the systemic cover-up that had persisted for nearly half a century. During this period, anonymous threats began arriving at the homes of several agents. One found a dead bird nailed to his front door. Another discovered his car tires slashed outside the Bureau's field office. These intimidation tactics mirrored the syndicate's old playbook, designed to instill fear without leaving proof. The FBI responded by tightening security and conducting internal sweeps for leaks, suspecting that someone within law enforcement might still be feeding information to the criminal organization. It was in this tense climate that a surprising lead emerged. A low-level bookkeeper tied to the syndicate, arrested for unrelated taxes, hinted that the Monroe case wasn't just a kidnap, it was a message. When pressed, he refused to elaborate, but his statement gave the task a new angle. The children might have been collateral in a larger scheme, not merely victims of chance. The FBI began digging into the syndicate's disputes in late 1978, focusing on debts, betrayals, and rivalries that might explain why innocent siblings were targeted. Slowly, in the fall of 1978, the Mahoning syndicate was locked in a power struggle over control of the steel mill unions and the lucrative contracts tied to them. Evidence suggested that Harold Monroe, the children's father, unknowingly crossed paths with syndicate business when he refused to approve fraudulent invoice accounting. What seemed like an honest man standing his ground may have provoked the wrath. The disappearance of Anna and Jacob, once thought random, now appeared as a calculated punishment meant to break a father's resolve and send a warning to others who dared resist. By 2006, the Monroe Task Force had mapped out a chilling hypothesis. The abduction of Anna and Jacob Monroe was an act of retaliation, a message delivered in blood and silence. Still, proving it required evidence strong enough to pierce decades of corruption. Investigators leaned on new forensic, digital reconstruction of satellite data, reanalysis of partial fingerprints once dismissed as inconclusive, and chemical testing of soil samples quietly taken near the old warehouse. Tiny traces of human DNA were found, degraded but undeniably. Although inconclusive at that stage, it confirmed that something violent had occurred there on the night of the disaster. As pressure mounted, internal resistance grew stronger. An anonymous memo circulated, warning that the feds were stirring up ghosts would remain buried. One councilman who had ties to a construction company once owned by the syndicate even attempted to pass a motion blocking federal access to municipal records. His sudden resignation weeks later, following exposure of hidden offshore accounts, proved to the FBI that they were closing in on the right circles of influence. The cover-up, they realized, was not an isolated act of 1978. It was a living organism that had adapted to protect itself for decades. Then came a breakthrough. A declassified FBI surveillance log from 1981 revealed that a black 1977 Lincoln Continental frequently visited the Mahoning River warehouse in the months after the siblings' disappearance. The car was registered to Frank DeLuca, a syndicate lieutenant known for his ruthlessness. DeLuca had died under suspicious circumstances in 1993, his body found in his garage with the ignition running, an alleged suicide, though many believed it was an execution disguised as an accident. His name, however, opened a door, for he had a surviving nephew, Anthony "Tony" DeLuca, who had recently resurfaced in Florida after years of low-profile existence. Agents began a quiet surveillance operation on Tony. Unlike his uncle, Tony was not a central figure. He had been a courier, a driver, someone who kept his head down. Yet his sudden re-emergence in the U.S. after years abroad drew suspicion. Wiretaps revealed coded conversations about old business in Ohio, enough to warrant deeper infiltration. They followed him to meetings in small motels where he exchanged cash for envelopes. Each piece of intel suggested he knew more about 1978. The FBI's strategy was patient. They documented his movements, tracked his communications, and intercepted financial transfers. A breakthrough came when agents intercepted an encrypted laptop Tony carelessly left behind in a Miami hotel. Digital forensics revealed fragments of scanned documents, altered police reports, payoffs to officials, and, most damningly, a blurred photograph showing two children bound and frightened inside what looked like the very Mahoning warehouse. Though grainy and incomplete, it was the first visual confirmation the task had ever seen. Faced with this, the FBI knew Tony had to be brought in, but carefully. A direct arrest could cause him to shut down, or worse, trigger retribution from the syndicate's remaining loyalists. Plans began for a capture operation, one that would isolate Tony from his protectors and force him to. For the Monroe case, after 28 years of silence, the walls were finally beginning to crack. The FBI spent months preparing the operation to bring in Anthony "Tony" DeLuca. He was cautious, rarely repeating routines and always traveling with hired bodyguards. Direct confrontation in public was too risky, both for civilians and for the possibility of a tip-off. Instead, agents devised a controlled scenario. They lured Tony into believing he was meeting an old syndicate contact in Cleveland, Ohio, at a warehouse along the Cuyahoga River. The bait was simple but irresistible, the promise of access to long-frozen syndicate funds hidden overseas. On the night of March 17, 2007, the operation began. Undercover agents posed as intermediaries, while tactical teams positioned themselves in unmarked vans nearby. Surveillance drones, new to FBI field use at the time, hovered silently above, recording every movement. Tony arrived in a rented Cadillac, his two bodyguards scanning the shadows with military precision. Inside the warehouse, dim lighting and carefully placed crates created the illusion of a clandestine exchange. What Tony didn't know was that every inch of the setup was under federal control. As the conversation began, agents played their roles with precision. One presented fabricated documents, hinting at offshore accounts once tied to Frank DeLuca. Tony leaned forward, intrigued but cautious, his voice low and guarded. He asked questions only an insider would know, probing for traps. When the answer satisfied him, he signaled to his men to bring in a briefcase. That was the moment the FBI had been waiting for. The signal was given, lights cut out, and tactical teams stormed in with synchronized precision. Chaos erupted. Tony's bodyguards reached for weapons but were immediately subdued, disarmed, and restrained. Tony himself froze, his face pale in the glow of tactical flashlight. Within seconds, was pinned against a wall, cuffed, and no shots were fired, no one injured. The operation was executed with clinical efficiency. For the first time in nearly 3 decades, someone tied to the Monroe disappearance was in federal custody. The interrogations began immediately at a secure facility. At first, Tony played the part of the hardened loyalist, insisting he knew nothing about 1978 and that the evidence was fabricated. But investigators had an arsenal. The laptop file, the grainy photograph of the children, and financial ledgers connecting him to payouts made just days after the abduction. Every lie he told was dismantled with hard proof. The facade began to crack, his confidence eroding with each hour. What finally broke him was fear, not of prison, but of the syndicate itself. Though weakened, remnants of the Mahoning syndicate still held power, and Tony knew betrayal meant death. Yet the FBI convinced him the only way to survive was to cooperate fully. Isolated, facing overwhelming evidence, and haunted by ghosts of the past, Tony agreed. He would confess everything, but on one condition: his testimony must guarantee him federal protection. The agents, realizing they were on the cusp of uncovering a decades-old atrocity, accepted. The truth of what happened to Anna and Jacob Monroe was about to. The interrogation room, stark, white walls, a metal table, a single recording camera humming in the corner. Tony DeLuca sat hunched forward, his hands trembling despite the cuffs having been removed. For the first time in his life, the weight of silence seemed heavier than the risk of betrayal. The lead agent, Special Agent Parker, leaned in and asked softly, "Tell us about October 12, 1978. Tony exhaled, eyes darting toward the before whispering, "Wasn't supposed to be that." They were just. From that moment, the dam broke and 4 decades spilled into the. According to Tony, the order had come directly from Syndicate Captain Frank DeLuca, his uncle. Harold Monroe had interfered with a scheme to funnel Union pension funds into the syndicate's control. Frank saw Harold's refusal as defiance, a dangerous precedent that could embolden others. The plan was to send a message, not by killing Harold outright, but by striking him where he was most vulnerable. On that foggy October night, Frank ordered Tony and 2 others to intercept the children on Jefferson Avenue. The black sedan was waiting before the. Tony described how Anna and Jacob were forced into the car at gunpoint, muffled cries drowned by the engine's growl. They didn't fight much. They were too scared to even scream. The car drove straight to the Mahoning River warehouse, where Frank was waiting with several other syndicate. Inside, the children were bound with electrical tape placed on wooden crates. Tony's voice cracked as he recalled Anna trying to shield her younger brother, whispering to him not to cry. That image never left me. Wiping. The plan, Tony revealed, had not been immediate execution. Frank intended to use the children as leverage, proof to Harold that his defiance had consequences. Harold was to be approached discreetly, forced to cooperate under threat of harm to his children. But something went wrong. Word reached Frank that the FBI was sniffing around the warehouse for unrelated smuggling operations. Fearing discovery, Frank ordered the children moved deeper into syndicate territory. They were transported that very night to a farmhouse on the outskirts of Austin town, owned by a corrupt deputy sheriff loyal to the syndicate. It was at the farmhouse, Tony admitted, where tragedy sealed their fate. Weeks passed with Harold refusing to bend, and the syndicate grew impatient. Arguments broke out among members. Some pushed for release, others demanded final action. Ultimately, Frank chose the. One night, under the cover of heavy rain, Anna and Jacob were taken to the basement. Tony was ordered to stay upstairs, but he heard muffled cries, then silence. Minutes later, the others emerged, carrying black plastic bags. The children had been suffocated, their bodies later buried under the farmhouse floor beneath freshly poured cement. Tony's confession was exhaustive, every detail cutting into the agents like a blade. He described the cover-up meticulously, how the corrupt deputy falsified logs, how local officers destroyed tapes, how payoffs kept the warehouse off-limits during FBI raids. The syndicate's web of influence had ensured the Monroe case remained unsolved while the family languished. When Parker asked what became of the remains, Tony hesitated, then nodded slowly. They're still there, beneath the basement. 47 years. and no one ever looked. The room fell into a heavy silence as the weight of 4 decades of unanswered prayers finally settled into grim truth. 2 weeks after Tony DeLuca's confession, the FBI coordinated a covert excavation of the farmhouse in Austintown, Ohio, the place he had described with chilling precision. The property had long since changed, its current owners unaware of the horrors hidden beneath their basement. Under the cover of night, forensic teams, ground-penetrating radar specialists, and crime scene investigators arrived, accompanied by U.S. Marshals to secure the perimeter. The operation was treated like a military exercise, its secrecy paramount, for leaks could allow syndicate remnants to interfere. The radar sweep confirmed what Tony had said. Beneath the basement concrete lay unusual cavities, irregular and inconsistent with the original building plans. The air inside the farmhouse grew suffocating as technicians drilled into the cement slab, the sound of machinery echoing like a requiem. By dawn, the first section of concrete was lifted, revealing a layer of disturbed soil. Shovels replaced drills, and every agent present worked in silence, their faces pale with the knowledge that they were unearthing not just evidence, but children's grave. Hours later, the first set of skeletal remains emerged. Tiny fragments of cloth clung stubbornly to the bones, faded beyond recognition, but still hinting at the innocent. A hush fell over the team as evidence bags were prepared and photographs taken. Then came the second set, smaller than the first, bones so fragile they seemed to crumble at the touch. DNA analysis would later confirm what everyone already knew in their hearts. Anna and Jacob Monroe had been there all along, entombed beneath the floor of a farmhouse owned by men sworn to uphold the law. Forensic experts meticulously documented every centimeter of the fibers of electrical tape were recovered, remnants of bindings corroborating Tony's account. Soil analysis revealed traces of plastic consistent with black garbage bags. Even fragments of a child's shoe were found, its rubber sole warped by time, yet unmistakably belonging to a young boy. The technical evidence, combined with Tony's testimony, left no doubt this was the Monroe burials. What had been rumor and speculation for nearly half a century was now a documented atrocity. When news of the discovery leaked, it spread like wildfire. Former officers who had stonewalled the case were suddenly under scrutiny. Journalists descended on Austintown, and surviving members of the Monroe family were notified. Anna and Jacob's surviving siblings, now in their 50s, collapsed in grief when federal agents confirmed the finding. One brother, voice broken, "At least we finally know. At least we can bring them home." The tragedy of their parents dying without answers hung heavy in the air, amplifying both the relief and the devastation of the moment. The farmhouse became a national crime scene, cordoned off with yellow and guarded day and night. The remains were transported to a forensic lab for official identification, but no one doubted the outcome. For the FBI task force, years of frustration had finally borne fruit, though the weight of what they uncovered pressed heavily on every agent present. The case was no longer just about evidence or corruption. It was about 2 children whose lives had stolen to send a message of power. Now, justice was finally within reach. The discovery beneath the farmhouse sparked the FBI needed to ignite a sweeping crackdown. Armed with Tony DeLuca's testimony, forensic evidence from the burial site, and newly uncovered financial records, federal prosecutors prepared indictments against surviving members of the Mahoning Syndicate and their corrupt allies in government. Arrest warrants were drawn up not only for aging mob figures, but also for retired law enforcement officers, judges, and councilmen who had aided in the decades-long cover-up. The Monroe case was no longer a cold file. It had become the centerpiece of a federal offensive against corruption in Ohio. The first wave of arrests came at dawn on June 9, 2007, when tactical teams executed simultaneous raids across Youngstown and neighboring towns. Elderly syndicate members, some long thought untouchable, were dragged from their homes in handcuffs. Former Deputy Sheriff Harold Briggs, the man who had provided the farmhouse the children's captivity, was arrested at his retirement home, his face a mask stunned red. In his basement, agents recovered ledgers showing payments to local officials in 1978, each entry meticulously recorded, damning proof of how deep the rot had spread. Corruption was not confined to law enforcement. A retired judge, once praised for his commitment to justice, was taken into custody after documents linked him to falsified warrants and court orders suppressing evidence during the original investigation. City council members from the late 70s, some now wealthy developers, faced charges for obstruction of justice and conspiracy. The narrative that had once dismissed the Monroe disappearance as unsolvable collapsed overnight, exposing a systemic betrayal of public trust that spanned generations. The media frenzy was unprecedented. Cameras swarmed courthouses, broadcasting the fall of men who had built entire careers on lies. For the Monroe siblings' surviving family, the arrests were bittersweet. Their lives had been marked by decades of unanswered questions, and while justice now seemed possible, it came decades too late. One sister, standing outside the courthouse, told reporters through tears, "We begged them to listen back then, and they told us we were crazy." 47 years later, they finally admit the truth. Her words became a headline repeated nationwide. Technical evidence played a crucial role in cementing the prosecution. The corrupted traffic logs, reconstructed navigation data from patrol cars, and the tampered camera reels, once brushed aside as clerical errors, were now reframed as deliberate acts of obstruction. Federal experts showed juries how timestamps had been altered, footage spliced, and reports falsified to erase the presence of certain officers near Jefferson Avenue on the night of October 12, 1978. What had once been invisible misdirection was laid bare as a calculated campaign to bury the truth. But amid the arrests and celebrations, there was an undercurrent of unease. The Mahoning syndicate had weakened, but not died. Younger associates, unindicted and watching from the shadows, still held influence in gambling and construction racket. Agents whispered that the old guard's downfall might spark reprisal, a reshuffling of power that could leave scars on the community. Justice had been served in part, but the fight against organized crime was far from over. The Monroe case had delivered long-awaited answers, but it had also awakened old enemies. The trials began in the spring of 2008, filling the federal courthouse in Cleveland with an air of grim anticipation. For weeks, the Monroe family sat on wooden benches, faces worn but resolute, as prosecutors laid bare the machinery of corruption that had swallowed their sibling in 1978. Courtrooms that once protected syndicate men now became their undoing, as testimony, documents, and forensic evidence wove an irrefutable narrative. The jury listened in stunned silence as prosecutors replayed Tony DeLuca's recorded confession, his trembling voice describing how Anna and Jacob were bound, hidden, and ultimately silent. Tony himself was brought to the stand under heavy, once defiant. He now looked frail, a man hollowed by the weight of betrayal and guilt. In meticulous detail, he identified the syndicate figures present at the farmhouse, the deputy who falsified reports, and the judge who suppressed evidence. He recounted payouts, threats, and the moment Frank DeLuca ordered the suffocation of the children. At times his voice broke, and the courtroom grew heavy with unease. Jurors averted their eyes as he described Anna's last attempt to comfort her younger brother. It was testimony that burned into the record as much as into their consciences. The defense fought viciously, painting Tony as a liar seeking leniency and accusing the FBI of coercion. They questioned the validity of degraded DNA, suggesting contamination. They insisted the skeletal remains could not be definitively linked without, but prosecutors countered with decades of falsified logs, hidden ledgers, and the farmhouse excavation that matched Tony's every word. The jury was not swayed by technical quibbles. The weight of truth was simply too great. Verdicts came swiftly. Guilty on all counts: conspiracy, obstruction of justice, kidnapping resulting in death, and racketeering. Life sentences were handed down to aging syndicate leaders, some too frail to even stand as the gavel fell. The corrupt deputy sheriff, Harold Briggs, was sentenced to life term, his reputation as a protector of the community forever shattered. Former officials faced years in federal prison, their legacies reduced to footnotes of disgrace. The Monroe siblings, absent in body but in every deed, had finally received justice through the law. For the surviving Monroe family, the verdicts were bittersweet. Tears flowed freely in the courthouse halls. They had answers, names, and even remains to bury properly, but the decades stolen from them could never be restored. One surviving brother told reporters, "We waited our whole lives to hear the truth. Now we have it, but it feels like victory wrapped in sorrow." His words captured the paradox of closure, the end of lies, but also the final acceptance or of loss. For the investigators, too, the trials left deep marks. Agent Parker, who had led the final years of the investigation, admitted to colleagues that the images from the excavation haunted him in his sleep. Younger agents, once eager to break the case, now carried the sobering weight of its resolution. They had won a battle for truth, but it came at the cost of confronting human cruelty in its rawest form. Justice was delivered, yes, but it felt incomplete, as though the ghosts of Anna and Jacob Monroe would forever linger in the halls of justice and in the memories of those who fought for it. On October 12, 2008, exactly 30 years to the day since Anna and Jacob Monroe vanished, their remains were finally laid to their parents' quiet cemetery. The service was small but heavy with emotion. Siblings, cousins, investigators, and even strangers who had followed the case gathered to honor the children who had become symbols of a town's betrayal. 2 caskets, modest and white, were lowered into the. A choir hummed softly, and the autumn air was filled with the sound of leaves brushing like whispers of closure. For the surviving Monroe siblings, the funeral was a wound reopening, even as it promised healing. They placed photographs, toys, and flowers into the graves, symbolic offer a childhood stolen. One sister placed a faded letter, written decades earlier, where she had promised Anna they would grow together. As the earth covered the cask, grief mingled with relief, but also a deep bitterness. Justice had been served in courts, but justice could never return the stolen years or repair the lives fractured by sin. The investigators stood at a respectful distance, observing the family's grief as their own unspoken burden. Special Agent Parker, who had carried the case in its final years, felt the familiar weight of unfinished business pressing down. Though arrests had been made, he knew remnants of the Mahoning Syndicate still lingered. Younger members, unindicted, continued to operate quietly in the shadows. The Monroe case had ended, but organized crime was not dismantled. It had merely adapted. The funeral was closure for a family, but not for the war against corruption. In the weeks that followed, the community of Youngstown struggled to process the revelation. The once whispered rumors of police complicity and judicial corruption were now undeniable facts exposed in national headlines. Trust in local institutions plummeted, and many residents spoke of betrayal deeper than any crime syndicate could inflict, the betrayal of those sworn to protect them. A new federal oversight was established, scars of decades-long. For every conviction, there was still the nagging question: how many others had been silenced, buried, or forgotten? Tony DeLuca, whose testimony had broken the case, was moved into federal witness protection. His name was erased, his face hidden behind new identity. Yet even in safety, he was a man condemned to memory. His cooperation had spared him the syndicate's wrath, but he lived knowing he had helped destroy innocent lives. For him, survival meant exile, a shadowed existence haunted by voices of children he could not save. His confession gave truth, but it offered no redemption. As winter approached, the Monroe case faded from headlines, replaced by new scandals, new tragedy. Yet in Youngstown, the story lingered like fog clinging to old steel mills, a reminder of innocence lost, corruption exposed, and justice that arrived too late. The graves of Anna and Jacob became a place of pilgrimage, flowers always fresh, notes left by strangers who never knew them but felt the weight of their story. The case was closed, officially, but in the quiet of Ohio nights there remained a whisper of tragedy, the uneasy knowledge that justice, even when delivered, is never truly complete. If you made it to the end, thank you for joining us on this story full of pain, mystery, and the relentless search for justice. Stories like Anna and Jacob Monroe's remind us how fragile the truth can be and how important it is to never stop. If this story moved you, I invite you to give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. That way you won't miss our upcoming stories filled with emotion, unexpected twists, and moments that touch the